Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to address the Insta members, the Insta friends, and also many people from other corners of the world who want to learn more about different approaches to managing and measuring accessibility. I always say managing and measuring at the same time because it's an inseparable binomial. So we'll see also today why accessible tourism policies are leading to inclusive societies. When I start my presentations, I always start pointing out that everything you do for the local population in terms of accessibility or people with accessible access requirements, you're also catering to tourists and vice versa. So accessibility should be always seen as something benefiting local people, but also benefiting tourists and visitors visiting your city, your village, or your establishment. At UNWTO, we've started working on accessible tourism 15 years ago. It was a very shy beginning where we were kind of thinking we were intruders in this field because normally it was done by disabled people's organizations because accessibility was run by the civil society and by NGOs, and the tourism sector did realize that there was a huge opportunity, but there was really no way to start doing this. And nowadays, there is more data on accessibility. We have to understand the market. As Dirk said, there are more than 16% of people with significant disability. So this number grew in 10 years, according to WHO, by 300 million people. We are talking about significant disability. For example, I don't have a leg, so I have 65% of disability. So that's a significant disability. But people who have minor extent of disability, they're not included here. So almost 50% of people aged more than 60 have a disability. So it's not only in the developed countries. The same trend of aging is also in all the emerging economies, because that is an issue that all the societies have. And for example, if we take the European Union, we have more than 101 million people, so it's 1 in 4 adults in the European Union that has some disability. And 2/3 of people with disabilities, that means 75% in the European Union, can afford to travel. That means they have economic means to travel, but if the tourism sector or destinations do not cater to the needs of this huge market that is ever evolving, we are losing a huge opportunity. And as we always say, that people with disabilities tend to travel accompanied, normally by 2 to 3 people, depending on the degree of disability. So there we are multiplying this market a lot. And the other day, I ran into a very interesting Australia tourism research that, according to Australia tourism research that is run by the government, 23% of domestic travelers in Australia, within the Australian territory, have some specific access requirement. And 21% of all tourism revenues from tourism income comes from people with some specific access requirements. And the interesting thing is, the majority of them do not have any visible disability. Forget about the wheelchair. The majority of people would have mental health issues, allergy to chemicals, allergy to different food. They would have difficulties understanding different alphabets, understanding the language, the way the interpretation of tourism and cultural attractions is described. So here we should also think about our destinations in the Insta network, that they all have their own realities, and the way to measure and manage the concept of accessibility for all of them would be quite different, but all with a common aim, as Dirk said, to achieve better quality of life for all, for people with or without disabilities. So here I've just put forward some instruments and a photo where people who are afraid of accessibility can see that you can put and remove things to make something accessible. It's not the same to make a hotel and, for example, make a new infrastructure. This is a 15th century palace in Cordoba in Spain. So you can see that things are removable. You should not be afraid of accessibility because you did not destroy the monument by putting this. You just facilitated access to more people to enjoy this palace, for example. When we speak about planning, managing, and measuring accessibility, we have all these different elements. We have policies, strategies to implement the policies. That is something more concrete than a policy. We have standards. So UNWTO, UN Tourism, worked with a group of partners, 85 experts from 35 countries for 5 years to come with international ISO standard on tourism for all, on accessible tourism for all. Standards should not be frightening people neither, because standards are not necessarily binding instruments. They can become binding if you implement them into local or national legislation, but they're more of guidance tools. They can become normative tools, but they're supposed to inspire people on how to harmonize, how to organize things in a systematic way, so travelers traveling from one country to another don't get totally confused when it comes to describing accessibility, when it comes to stating how accessible you are, because that brings a huge frustration at the consumer's end if we don't speak the same language. We might describe different concepts, but we need to have a common language to describe it. And of course, there is a statistical framework, there are technical manuals on indicators, there are declarations, like Dirk said, the San Marino Declaration on the Future of Accessible Tourism 2030, and there are awards, because awards can be also granted against a group of indicators. So we have all these instruments, but still we need much more data, because there is no global engine of collecting global statistics on accessible tourism. When it comes to destination management organizations, and also most of observatories do have this character, either at the local or regional level. Sometimes destinations, of course, have a national level. What is the focus of the ISO standard that we are promoting, and also when we produce the guidelines for the implementation of this standard? We have to bear in mind that standards are very structured and dry documents, so we need implementation guides to work on them. So we produced, in collaboration with the ONCE Foundation, with UNE, that is the Spanish standardization organization, and also European Network for Accessible Tourism, a series of guidelines. The first one is how to apply the ISO standard among destination management organizations. And here we collaborated with Turismo de Portugal, with Turismo Argentina, to legitimate this document. So we are having the focus here in these guidelines on policies benefiting tourists and locals, as I said, on training of tourism officials and professionals, on people's comfort, safety, and quality of life. I would say that these three words are key when it comes to having a local vision of why are you working on accessible tourism. I would say this is something to start with. And the guidelines for action are to build strategy with disabled people's organization and the industry. I think the case of Malaga and the case of Südtirol will tell us more on how you'll work with the civil society, with the end users. It's about creating monitoring and evaluation indicators that work for you, that work for your own reality, that cater to your own local needs and features. And it's also encouraging survey, audit, complaint, and feedback systems, and suggesting corrective actions based on data, because otherwise we will be just sitting in our office and suggesting what else needs to be done. But if we don't have the feedback system from the end users, we are really shooting in the wrong direction. When it comes to standards and tourism companies, we worked again with the same partners, but this time also with Sustainable Hospitality Alliance and also some other partners from the private sector. And we focused on three specific elements where we have more accessibility challenges maybe than in others. That is the accommodation, food and beverage services, and MICE. The guidelines for action here are to assess accessibility levels of each establishment. That's something to start with, because sometimes company asks us, how should we start with this? Well, you should assess how accessible you are. You should prioritize improvements step by step. Not everything can be reshuffled from the very beginning. There needs to be skills developed of all the stuff. We always speak about the frontline stuff, but if the managers are not trained in accessibility, they cannot really manage the change, because the change needs to happen. And it's about employing the workforce with disability. If your hotel or your food and beverage establishment or your MICE sector within your destination, within the INSTA Observatory's jurisdiction, have workforce with disability, that means that they can also cater to clients with disabilities, because very often that's a perfect match. And we also need to quantify how much money the private sector loses for not being able to cater to people with disabilities, their families, or anybody with any kind of specific access requirement out of high season or in any other period of the year where you really need to keep afloat with your business. And here we put a picture of a family, because sometimes you would see a family with a toddler, like here, and you wouldn't think of these people as end users of specific access requirements. But this young family with a toddler does need accessibility as well. When it comes to standards in nature tourism, we managed it in a way to promote protected nature areas, beaches, parks and gardens, and accessible routes that are combining all these elements. We worked with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Chilean partners as well, and some other partners. And the guidelines for action are to harness the technology to bridge obstacles, because you cannot break the mountain, but you can create maybe different technological solutions to approach a natural resource to people so they can enjoy it in a virtual way. You also need to think about people with sensory disabilities. So we have so many people now with sensory disabilities. We can install wayfinding systems, rails, tactile markers in the nature. We can provide direct and accessible booking options, so people with disabilities don't need to make 100 phone calls in order to visit an interpretation center of a nature areas. When it comes to standards and cultural tourism, we have pretty much the same challenges. You cannot always adapt the historic heritage, the cultural heritage, but you can innovate in design, in interpretation, in presentation, in digital channels. And we also need to implement evaluation indicators on what works and what doesn't work. Accessibility Indicators Manual was a publication we produced with the ONCE Foundation and the European Network for Accessible Tourism in 2015. And this is a kind of methodology that we recommend as one of the approaches, as well as the standards, as well as the approaches that INSTO members are going to feature today, because it's sending a message and the methodology to DMOs to define what is the tourism value chain for them, so that is applied to a given territory and its reality, where we need to have the scope and geographical surface that we are analyzing. We have to analyze in this destination which are the elements relevant to each link, because in some destination you have more hotels, in others you have camping. And what are the key issues to be assessed? For example, here, accessibility indicators, key issues. For example, they have to do with the mobility. Is it easy to move through the space? For example, personnel and training. Have people be trained on which skills? When it comes to usability, for example, if we want to develop sub-indicators, we can speak, for example, about the furniture. Can I use the furniture when I enter the space? Are public areas equally accessible as the private areas, for example, of my room? And management, for example. Is accessibility managed in a systematic way? Is there a policy on the management, or you just do it on an ad hoc basis? Do you have staff working on accessibility? So, for example, for us at UN Tourism, I work on accessibility, but that's maybe 50% of my work. Some destinations do have people that are exclusively dedicated to accessibility. So both approaches perfectly work for people. And I would like to thank you for your attention. This is just before I finish the measuring of sustainable tourism framework that was adopted this year at the United Nations. So here we also included the planning and measuring of accessibility along the whole value chain. So the accessibility needs to be measured in the planning. We can measure, for example, how many websites we have that feature destinations accessibility through an official portal. We have transportation, for example, how many platforms provide information in accessible formats. For example, how many interface terminals we have. We can have accommodation, how many hotels have employees trained. When it comes to, for example, food and beverage services, how many restaurants have information on allergens. When it comes to tourism resources, how many, for example, have information on accessible transportation to reach, for example, these nature areas that I indicated here with the photo to use this itinerary. And of course, for public administrations, for example, we can have the number, for example, of official complaints that you have received and you have processed. So these are just different methods, different approaches that you can combine together, make your own cocktail and apply to your own personal reality. Thank you very much.